starting with Mr. Authers and then following to the other speakers. The very first question I have is this. It's quite foundational and quite basic, but I assume increasingly complex as well. So what does Brexit mean? So what will Brexit actually look like? What do you think is the likely relationship between the UK and the EU after this? And I also wanted to see if any of you would think that Brexit is inevitable, in terms of, is there any space for us to think that there would be a legal or economic case under which the referendum result would be ignored and the popular vote reversed? So Mr. Authers, if you want to get us started.
Okay, well that's a nice straightforward set of questions to start. In Theresa May's phrase, she's deflected a lot of questions about this by saying Brexit means Brexit, but now we need to know what Brexit means. Very quickly, I'd like to say I'm very honoured to be on this panel. The last time I was in this room, I was receiving my diploma for the Masters that Columbia University very kindly gave me. So it's wonderful to be back at the alma mater. Also, I'm very privileged. I feel very privileged and honoured to be sharing a panel with Sir John Vickers. As for many years ago, when I was an undergraduate at Oxford, I attended his lectures and learnt much of what I know about competition policy from him. I should also add, rather sadly, I feel very guilty to admit that a lot of the key players in the Brexit drama, David Cameron, Michael Gove, Boris Johnson, were all my direct contemporaries at Oxford. I feel my generation has not done a great job by our country. Now, I work for the Financial Times. I voted to remain. The Financial Times is one of the few British papers to take a vocally strong position in favour of remaining, and I've had the experience, which has been very new to me in my career, of really getting a lot of quite savage and aggressive feedback. People are very angry with us. I've had my patriotism questioned on many occasions, my belief in the free market question. My best guess, ultimately what Brexit means depends on British politics and on the game theory that's going to emerge as Britain and the EU attempt to negotiate the terms of this divorce. My best guess, the single most likely scenario for what Brexit means, is that Britain really is going to pull up the drawbridge and slam halt to inward migration to the UK, accepting in the process the damage that this will do to the financial services industry in the city, and accepting that we will lose direct access to the single market. That's more about the judgment on UK politics than anything else, which plainly we'll need to discuss as we go on. But it seems to me that a preponderance of the people who voted to leave voted because they thought this would mean we would be able to put up the drawbridge. I think it's possible that we end up with what might be called a Brexit light, where we do maintain access to the single market, and in return for that accept a much more limited shift in migration policy. Obviously a key point as far as the city is concerned is that the UK-based banks maintain their passporting privileges to the rest of the EU. In many ways there is a division between those who are in favour of leaving, which is very similar to the division that we see at the moment in the US Republican Party. There is a Chamber of Commerce pro-business side to this, and there is a populist anti-immigration side to this. The problem, I think, is that the populist anti-immigration side is bigger. But there are many people who have talked about the similarities between Brexit and the Trump campaign. Yes, there are some similarities. What I think is least likely, but still possible, is that the European Union capitulates and we basically only leave the EU in name and continue to have access to the single market while having much more control over migration. I think that's unlikely for reasons of game theory. I don't think the EU can capitulate. In terms, moving on to the issue of whether it's possible that we might indeed not leave at all, that Brexit doesn't happen. And my colleague Gideon Rachman went on record, I think 2 days after the vote, once it had become clear that David Cameron wasn't going to implement Article 50 straight away, with his belief that it wasn't going to happen. I am not sure I agree with Gideon on that, although I think it was a very interesting and important point of view. I do, however, agree that it is possible that we will go through, we the British will go through with not leaving. My own judgment, again, this is a judgment on British politics more than anything else, is that it can only happen if we have a second referendum. I don't think a general election would be enough of a democratic imprimatur not to go through with this, for the simple reason that we're not going to have any political party that is electable that will make the case to stay. Labour is not, Labour and the Liberal Democrats are not in a position to win a general election. I can imagine negotiations going badly and the Conservatives deciding to put this to a second referendum. I just cannot imagine what would happen to the British body politic if, without any stamp of democratic legitimacy, we decided not to go through with this. It's politically not possible in my judgment. I suppose one final scenario, if we stall long enough, is that the kind of development we're seeing in Europe as a result of the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis might lead to some formal creation of a two-speed Europe. It might conceivably become a moot issue. The politics within the rest of the European Union may make it much more easy politically for Britain to stay in a second tier of an EU. I've spoken longer than I thought. Ultimately, I think the single most likely scenario is that we have an ugly, anti-immigrant, business-unfriendly, Europe-unfriendly Brexit. That is still, I think, the single most likely outcome.
Thank you. Ambassador.
Thank you, Anu. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I do understand that I do represent Europe here at the table. So this game I try to present and share with you some ideas of the way we will look at these possible scenarios. Brexit is there, it's a fact. I do not think there is any way of a possible turn back. Irrespective of whether the referendum produced actual or legal consequences from a political point of view, the gene cannot be put back into bottom. So this is the case. This has not been the first time that a major European country voted against a European decision. We have a long set of precedents of votes against major European decisions. Denmark twice, France importantly objected to the ratification of the European Constitution, Ireland, the Netherlands, and again Hungary will hold a referendum on October the 2nd. But make no mistake, Brexit is different. This is the first time that that country, a member of the EU, decided frankly to turn back and shut the door. From a personal point of view, you were very kindly in reminding several positions I hold in my career. I devoted many years working on Europe, working for Europe. I also served in Brussels as European official. I was one of those technocrats that are so despised. So I do know the relevance and importance of these issues, and I'm fully aware that for too many years, for a number of reasons that I could elaborate on, we have been taking decisions without any proper public debate. Jacques Delors used to say that decisions were taken by Europe le visage caché, by hiding your face. So without any proper debate. This was done probably for the good reasons. When our founding fathers, as we say in Europe, met in Rome, and they decided to sign the treaty back in 1957, they did so because they were animated by values, by ideals, but they didn't ask European citizens whether this was exactly what they wanted. So now there is a need to address all these issues. We have to take the facts as they are. As I said, Brexit is there. There is no way that we can change the scenario. The point is now when, as John was suggesting, when Britain will actually decide to trigger this now famous Article 50. What I do think is that this won't happen any soon. Not just because of British political decisions, but because Europe is moving. It's not just Europe versus 27 member states. The situation is Europe is highly dynamic. Tomorrow, 27 leaders will be meeting in Bratislava. This will be the first time that we have a major summit without a member state, because Britain still is a member state of the EU, from a legal point of view. They will look into the face of our leaders and will decide what to do. The President of the European Council, Tusk, addressed a letter to the fellow members of the Council. He decided to call the letter the Bratislava letter. So just to put some drama on this. It is a very, very strong message. Quite unusual, I have to say. It's not a typical diplomatic language. It's sort of a call to responsibility. We'll see how leaders will react. But I think that if I may imagine the possible timing of this Article 50 triggering, this will not happen before major European countries will have elections next year. 2017 is an important year in Europe. We'll be starting having elections in the Netherlands in March, and then the French elections in May, and then eventually the political elections in June, and then in September in Germany. Having to deal with Article 50 before this is going to happen seems to be very, very difficult. What might be the possible relation between Britain and EU? There are already different possible scenarios. There is a very important and prominent European think tank, Bruegel. Bruegel came up with a document suggesting a sort of continental partnership, something that we have never experienced before. What really matters, and I do agree with John that migration issue is important, the EU is based on 4 freedoms. By far the most important one is freedom of movement. I'm sure that when negotiations will actually start, we will be able to find possible legal arrangements to allow quota for foreign workers, but what cannot be taken out of the table unless we completely change the dynamic of Europe is free movement to Europe, because this will be the end of what we consider nowadays in Europe.
Thank you. Professor Weiler.
Thank you for inviting me. Brexit is regrettable because it was totally unnecessary. Solving a petty problem of the Tory party might lead to the breakup of the United Kingdom, apart from the damage to the European Union and the world. But as the ambassador said, it is what it is, and certainly there's no way, not only it could, but it should not be reversed without another referendum. There's an issue of value. But I want to address the attitude of Europe to Brexit. So after the initial shock, what we find now is a kind of truculent anger. We are going to play hardball. The Brits are not going to get an easy ride from us. If they divorce us, we divorce them. Free movement is not negotiable, we just heard it. And if they, since from a political point of view, free movement is really what triggered, or the main catalyst, the hallmark of Brexit, so Britain can't in any meaningful way compromise on free movement, so then we have the drawbridge scenario. And that too is unnecessary. So now there are many lawyers here. The European Union has a set of extensive agreements with hundreds of countries around the world, which allow access to the marketplace, both for goods and services, without free movement. If you take CETA, which was negotiated with Canada, and you just offered Britain the same privileges that were offered Canada, in goods, in services, in standards, 80% of British demands would be satisfied right there and then, and no free movement is involved. If you take the agreement with Turkey, that beacon of democracy, it has a customs union with the European Union. If, and I think it would be a win-win that Britain should be part of a customs union, so how could you offer Turkey something that you would not offer the United Kingdom? And there's a tiny little footnote there, because the customs union generates money, and that can be some kind of British contribution to the European Union budget, because any goods coming from the rest of the world to Britain attracting customs duties would be part of the customs union. I go beyond that. Practically, not practically, every single member states of the European Union has, again, this is not hyperbole, hundreds of bilateral investment treaties with countries around the world. Under these bilateral investment treaties, there are passport privileges. There are passport privileges. If you have an investment in a member state of the European Union under a bilateral investment treaty, you cannot stop the directors, the personnel necessary to operation of the investment to enter into that member state. So when I said this kind of hardball free movement is not negotiable, on what basis, with what rationale, would you deny the United Kingdom that which you offer so many countries around the world which have a far weaker nexus than the United Kingdom has, and where the European Union has a far smaller interest in keeping them close and cozy? So it's not perfect. There would still have to be negotiations. But if the starting point, if, for example, hypothetically, the European Union would get off this angry horse and say the starting point for negotiation would be that we immediately offer Britain all the privileges that we offer any other country with which we have trading agreement, CETA being the benchmark, and then adding to it, the whole prospect of the negotiation changes in dimension. Then you are negotiating some hard issues, but on the periphery, and free movement is not on the table. Free movement is not on the table because there's no free movement with Canada, there's no free movement with Turkey, there's no free movement with any of these other countries, except for the purpose of managing your investment, be it in banking, be it in services, etc. So what explains the European attitude? It's not just peeved and angry and you don't like us so we won't like you. There's a fear that if you give Britain too cozy a ride, too comfortable a ride, it might be tempting to other member states who will say, well, that looks attractive, we want a similar deal. Embrace that. If other member states, it's not such a great deal because Britain doesn't have a voice at the table, so the standards set by the European Union will be without Britain, and either they like it or their goods or services don't enter. So it's an asymmetrical relationship, but that's what it is. But if other member states, a Hungary, a Poland, a Slovakia, they are on my count about 7 member states whose governments are openly Eurosceptic. If they say we like this deal with the United Kingdom, it allows access to the market, not exactly on the same terms, it allows passport privileges, it allows extensive active of services, we would be comfortable with that. I would say to them, bon voyage, because this will bring about the disintegration of the Union. What's the future of the Union? Which I think we will come back later. If you have 6 or 7 recalcitrant member states who don't want to move ahead and have a veto power on any movement ahead. It will be a moment of truth. There will be de facto géométrie variable, Europe de vitesse, and it might, as a side bonus, solve the Turkish problem. Because Turkey would never accept to be a member on any terms other than first-class membership, But if she had the same status as the United Kingdom, that looks a lot more palatable, and it will be a lot more palatable to everybody else, precisely because there's no free movement provision in any such arrangement. Thank you.
Thank you. Then, Professor Authers.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to take part in this wonderful event. Whenever I'm sitting in the audience at an occasion like this, I want to see lots of disagreement among the panelists. And I fear, I tell you right away, I agree with nearly everything that's been said. And taking that in conjunction with the pair of opening remarks, where is the grit in this oyster? So one thing I might do during the session, and others may as well, though some of us can be less diplomatic than others, of course, I would like to articulate some arguments that I don't agree with them, that I think are respectable arguments for Brexit. And I want to voice what I think are some quite major criticisms about the way the European Union is at the moment. But first, I do want you to know my true view is completely in line with what's been said. I felt more strongly about this than any political issue ever. I was very strongly for us remaining. I think it was a disaster that Prime Minister Cameron got us into this mess, quite unnecessarily, I agree. I think it's bad for the UK, bad for Europe, and bad for the wider world. But we are where we are, and like others, short of some obvious catastrophe happening, I see very little scope for the reversal of this decision. I spent probably about 2 weeks hoping for a kind of national Groundhog Day where the alarm clock would go off and it was still the morning of June the 23rd and a different result would happen. But one has to be realistic, and I think it's very important that Remainers don't just cling on to the hope that it can be reversed. I think there are huge policy issues facing Britain and Europe that the Remainers need to engage constructively in that debate because the stakes are so large. What does Brexit mean? In terms of domestic law, I think it means a repeal of the European Communities Act of 1972. And I think at the end of the process that will be very likely what will happen. If the 1975 referendum had gone the other way, that would have been reasonably straightforward. But where we are now is we have decades of British law, which is European law. So if you just unplug from the European Union, a lot of the legal system simply collapses. So domestically, we're going to need a bridging operation from one regime to another. And this has happened before, including in the United States in the 1780s. So it's not completely unprecedented. And in India in the late 1940s. So it's not a completely new situation. What might Brexit look like? Here I'm going to agree with those. I just think it's impossible to imagine that there would be agreement for the UK to remain a full member of and access to the single market are totally different things. I see no way that we can be a full member and have the immigration controls that the Brexit side want. I think it's just inconceivable that that would be agreed to. Now, full EEA membership, where you are a full member, you continue to have free movement of people as well as goods, services and capital, you continue to make contributions. I actually think that would be the least bad outcome. It's the closest to where we were. It's obviously worse because you don't have UK say on the development of the regulations. I think that's bad for the UK. And I would say this, wouldn't I? But I actually think that's bad for Europe as well. I think the UK influence, not always, but more often than not, has been a positive thing. But the problem with that, it would, because it's in every respect worse than what we had, I just don't see anybody signing up to that. It would be a complete failure for the Brexit camp if that ended up being the answer. So I think, and I agree with others who said that the most likely result is some more distant relationship. I think in terms of trade, I think trade in goods, or goods that are sort of reasonably simple, I don't think the issues there are huge because tariff levels are not enormous, and we've had in effect a 10% depreciation. I mean, a great thing about having a floating exchange rate, unlike most countries in the EU, is that when a bad thing happens, you can adjust really quickly and get on with life rather than this decade-long agonies that some countries are going through. I think the real problem, as has been indicated, are services and particularly the non-tariff barriers and the regulatory requirements and all the rest, where I think the outlook is really quite gloomy for the UK, and the fact that we've had this exchange rate depreciation makes a lot of sense. Can I end with articulating two arguments? This is for the sake of balance and diversity, and I think these are respectable arguments. They're not anti-foreigner arguments or anything of that kind. One, a historian colleague of mine had a piece in The Spectator, and although I disagree with this, his argument was that sovereignty is the most important thing. It speaks to the points made earlier about accountability and indeed about identity. And his argument was that there is dysfunctionality of decision-making in the European Union, such that many important decisions don't get taken because, in effect, there's a veto power. So you just have stasis. And if you are chained to that, this sort of inertia is just no good in the dynamic world economy. On the other hand, if you move to more majority voting in Europe, then you're going to be in the minority, even on average, for an average member state, a fair proportion of the time, and probably in the UK's case, more than an average proportion of the time. So either way, neither scenario looks good, you are better out. Another argument which I heard from a very senior politician of yesteryear was putting the internationalism point we heard earlier on its head. His position, I'm characterising it, was that in the third quarter of the 20th century, Britain had lost an empire and hadn't found a role. It was very insular. In 1970, the way for the UK to be internationalist was to join the European Union. If you look at the external policies of the European Union in areas like trade, agriculture, and in other respects, in some sense it is not very internationalist. So his view was that given where we are now, 2015-16, the way to be internationalist is to look well beyond Europe. India, China, Asia, Latin America. So I don't agree with it, but I think there is a case to be made that it is not necessarily insular to have made this move. And I also would say, given the earlier remark about the Warburg Institute and so on, I think my university and others like it, which overwhelmingly remain, I think the feeling is just as internationalist this month as 6 months ago.
Great, thank you. So I wanted to move now a little bit to discuss the consequences of Brexit on the future of the European integration. So a couple of years ago, I had a student who felt compelled to explain why he did not want to take my EU law class, and he said, well, it feels like I'm taking Soviet Union law in 1989. So I guess my question to the panelists is whether he was wise to make that choice, whether this is the beginning of the end, whether Brexit will cause the entire European project to unravel, or whether the European Union will survive this. So if we can now start from Ambassador Varricchio.
I start from your students' comments. This reminds me years ago, the time when I used to serve in Brussels, not in a national capacity, but as an advisor to the President of the Commission. That was a time when enlargement was the great mission. And we will be traveling Central European countries, trying to promote enlargement, trying to respond to the requests of those countries emerging from the dark era of being part of a communist world, offering them access to Europe. And I do remember once, it was very in Poland, a student asked for the floor and made a very disturbing question at the time, completely changed the dynamic and the psychology. She asked, Mr. President, she was addressing the President of the Commission, why should we like to enter into another union now that we are finally managed to exit one another? So there was a matter of national pride, of national identity, and I pick up Sir John's issue of identity. Can we really say we the people here? Where are we able to, when are we able to promote this European identity? When we say, when Joseph Weiler starts his comment by saying us and them, I think that you refer to 27 versus Britain. I frankly believe that won't be any 27. So the dynamic has already started to change. In many countries, we start asking, what's the point? It's not simply chopping off one of the members of the EU and remaining as we are. The dynamic has completely changed. Hungary will hold a referendum on October the 2nd. The specific issue at stake is to accepting a quota of migrants. But the real issue at stake is are we forced to accept decisions taken in Brussels? This is not just a legal point, it's a true political issue. So being part of the same democratic body. So this will change the dynamic. And what is particularly sad is that Brexit happens at a time when Europe was not in time of setting new brave ideas and targets. No enlargement, no single currency, no constitution. The two major decisions taken in recent years have been the Stability Pact and the partial implementation of the banking union. Not exactly something that able to spread European sentiments among the citizens. So there is a need to give a new sense of destiny. I think this is something that we have to do if we want to respond to what British people decide. I don't want to elaborate, as my two fellow panelists coming from Britain did, on the reasons why the referendum was called in Britain. But what is true is that we have to take the results as they are. What would be the possible dynamic? Joseph Weiler mentioned a possible CETA scenario. From a trade policy point of view, the trade agreement negotiated between the EU and Canada is considered a very positive one, particularly good for Europe. But it's not by chance. The CETA is not ratified. Because when it comes to trade agreements, European people become skeptical. So for any kind of legal arrangement that will ultimately be decided between the EU and Britain, we better be sure that this agreement is duly approved and ratified. We have to offer something, not just to Britain, but to our own people. I think that Brexit has been an alarm for all of us. For European leaders, they have to be honest, and they have to realize that something is not going to work anymore. When it comes to the possible solutions, I think that I mentioned this kind of partnership. This is true for relations between countries, but it is also true when it comes to our ability to cope with external threat. I might elaborate later on this, but I think that there is a growing sentiment in Europe and amongst European citizens that when it comes to external challenges, external threats, we better pull the drawbridge. And we better ask our national leaders to protect us. So there's an issue of trust when it comes to a sharing of responsibility, a sharing of security.
Thank you. Professor Weiler.
So, in one sense, I can't answer your question if it's a kind of crystal ball gazing what's going to happen. I was very prudent in not saying anything what will happen in Brexit, and I'm glad that I didn't pronounce myself because most pundits got it wrong. So I don't think there's a basis really to have a prediction. But I want to, in terms of what will happen, I want to say more what should happen, and if it doesn't, then we are indeed. So, Europe continues to suffer, despite the Treaty of Lisbon, from a profound democracy deficit, which I can explain in 60 seconds. No matter what form of democracy we know in what used to be called the West, there are two primitive principles. One is the principle of accountability. The Brits have a nice expression, the ability to throw the scoundrels out, to decide who will govern you. And that possibility does not exist in the system of governance of the European Union. It's governance without government, so there's no day in the civic calendar of the European Union where if enough citizens vote in a certain way, they can change the government. And the second basic primitive principle of democracy is the principle of representation. If enough people vote in a certain way, if there's a plurality or a majority on the center-left, it gets translated into center-left politics. If there's a plurality or majority on the center-right, it gets translated into center-right politics. There is, after all, a difference if Britain is governed by the Tories or by Labour, or if Germany or Spain is governed by Rajoy or by Zapatero. It's not a huge difference, but there is a meaningful difference. And that second condition of democracy, the translation of voter preference into policy, does not exist in the European Union. There's no link in the outcome of elections to the European Parliament, whether it's a center-left majority or center-right majority, that gets translated into the policies of the European Union. And the proof of the pudding is in the eating, because despite the fact that the European Parliament has gained all the powers it has practically asked for, it is a co-legislator with the Council of Europe, with the European Council, the Council of Ministers, I beg your pardon. In every single election since 1979, fewer and fewer people have gone out and voted, including the last elections in 2014. It was the lowest rate of participation. And the people are wise. Why vote if my electoral preferences are not translated into policy? Left, right, austerity, growth, whatever it may be. So whence the legitimacy of the Union? It has always been a result-oriented legitimacy. We legitimate ourselves by the results we produce. And that's why when the results suddenly collapsed with the crisis of 2008, with it collapsed, a serious legitimacy crisis occurred. And if you cannot deliver the goods, you don't have the resources of process democracy that enable you to take certain measures. What has been the response to Brexit has been we have to come up with a new narrative, a new destiny, but nobody has yet articulated it, because what is it? So what we have to come out is with more goodies. Security, very important. A list of goodies. A very impressive speech by President Juncker yesterday in the European Parliament, but it's basically a list of things we can do, which, because they are important and necessary, they will mobilize support from public opinion. What you don't have, not before Brexit and not after Brexit, is a realization that this is a hugely important system of governance, and it suffers from this fundamental democracy deficit, which inevitably brings about the kind of alienation which we are seeing throughout Europe. So what will be the future? If this core problem is not addressed, the future is grim, because there reaches a point of Gasset, the revolt of the masses. We don't want to be governed when we don't really have a meaningful say in who governs us and how we are governed. If Brexit is used as a catalyst to actually address that core fundamental problem, I don't want to say the future is rosy, but your student can continue taking the course.
Thank you. I actually saw there's a question from the front to Professor
Yes,
Weiler.
I just have a clarifying question, if I may. Can people hear me like this? All right, I think we're okay. Sorry, Constance Stelzner, I think I can probably project. All right? Sorry about that. Constance Stetson-Miller. I'm the designated Hun for the second panel. The Merkel surrogate, if you will. I just want to draw you out, Professor, not having taken your courses, on what your position actually means. If you say that fixing the problem of accountability representation is desirable, then surely the only solution for the first tier and the two-tier or the multiple speed Europe that you advocate would be complete federalism.
I can see that you haven't taken my course, because in my course the word federalism is banned because it's so totally underspecified. Federalism means whatever one wants it to be. It's just a word for a divided system of governance. It's not federalism, but it is a much more political union. At the core of democracy, there's choice. The reason why a one-party democracy, even if there are free elections, is not considered a democracy because there is no choice. So at the core of democracy, there's choice, there's political choice. When the European elector goes to elect the European Parliament, he or she needs to have a choice. If I vote this way, this is who will govern me, and this, it will be a center-left program or a center-right program. So it means a much more political Europe. It means politics without politics cannot be democracy. Politics which says, once we have the Commission in place, we are apolitical, we are non-partisan, we represent each issue of Europe, it's nonsense. There's no such thing as the choices that are made which are not political. It's just burying them underground. So let democratically Europe decide, does it want a more austerity approach or does it want a more growth approach? So that's what it means. I don't call that federalism because Europe is already federal. I say introducing openly, with certain risks involved, politics into the system of governance of the European Union with real choice. So the Spitzenkandidaten exercise was a good start. It of course didn't have much traction. Of course the European Council said we're not going to repeat the exercise, etc. But it was the first time that there was a sliver of politics in the politics of the European Union, and that's the direction it has to go. We live by that in our member states. When Labour loses, the left is angry, but they accept they lost the election. And that is true in every member state, and that will be true for Europe as well.
Thank you. Professor Vickers.
Well, I think the point about the democratic deficit that's been so well articulated, I think is really important. And the Leave campaign in the UK, their sort of strapline was take back control, or let's take back control, which I think in a way was in a few words trying to get exactly that. And there are points to be made about that. They're quite serious ones. I thought what I might add, though, on a different, less about the politics but more about the economics, is to develop a bit the point about the euro area. I mean, imagine Brexit if we'd also had the euro as our currency. I mean, then the problems would have been, I don't know whether the result would have been the same or different, but the difficulties there would have been absolutely overwhelming. And on the question of whether the European project is going to unravel in terms of others leaving, I think leaving a common currency area is formidably difficult, as we saw at various stages of the Greek crisis. And I think the formation of the common currency, putting the cart before the horse, because single monetary areas only have resilience and flexibility and robustness if there's deeper political union within the members of the currency union, with the ability to transfers and maybe some centralized settings of economic policy. But because it was done the other way around in Europe, I think that's a severe, it's a chronic problem, which will be episodically, it'll be calm and then it'll flare up and so on. It builds in all sorts of flexibilities. And because the general sense of macroeconomic policy, I mean, the ECB has got with monetary policy at its limits. I mean, in terms of fiscal policy, I think you do have a deflationary bias. In the strong or surplus countries, they do not have the national incentive to adopt expansionary policies which the countries in other position will take. So I think we're locked in within the Eurozone to an extremely unfortunate economic and monetary straitjacket. And it's sort of fingers crossed, nothing too bad will happen, but I think the risks are really quite great. I mean, my view is that the right answer for Europe is two levels. The common currency members need to integrate more, then others perhaps could have more flexibility. But I just don't think it's going to happen, because the political prospects of deeper integration among the Eurozone members just seems impossible. There'll be treaty changes, there'll be referenda all over the place. It will get tripped up very, very quickly. So I think Europe is sort of trapped in this very unfortunate set of economic and monetary arrangements. May turn out okay, but I think there are big risks attached to that.
Thank you. Let me bring in Mr. Authers, and then I take one more question from the audience.
Okay, well, I agree with a lot of what I've just heard. I also wanted to raise the issue that John just raised. In many ways, if you want the straw that if the European integration project is going to go into reverse, if those great aims and demands are going to steadily be frittered away, I suspect history will eventually deem that the over-hasty introduction of the euro without the necessary degree of coordination, without the necessary institutions necessary to undergird it, without the different economies being sufficiently aligned with each other, that will probably be seen as the critical first error, the first step away from integration, rather than Brexit. I do feel, having listened to the conversation already, that we've actually heard all the arguments I've heard that were better than the ones we actually had aired during the referendum campaign for not remaining part of the European Union. I do feel bitter as a British person that if we're going to leave Europe because of the democratic deficit and then take control ourselves with our monarchy and our unelected House of Lords, there is a certain cognitive dissonance there. If we were worried about the EU's democratic deficit, which is very real and very important, perhaps there were a few other things we could have done at home first before moving in that direction. One final point I'd like to make: evidently, whatever kind of a deal we arrive at is going to set an extremely negative, very negative precedent for further integration. You can see, both through the mess of the Eurozone and the realization that we need a banking union, that we need some kind of fiscal union, that we need some ability to issue bonds, that creates some kind of a necessity of an inner tier, and the point that you can well imagine some UK deal which the likes of Hungary and Poland would be very happy to go along with. You can, between the two incidents of the Eurozone and the Eurozone and its problems and the Brexit and its referendum, see some way of getting from where we are now to some kind of a viable two-speed, two-tier Europe. The big problem, as Sir John pointed out, was at the moment the Eurozone includes Greece, and not just Greece but also Spain and Portugal, whereas a viable common currency area might be Benelux, Germany, Austria, maybe France, but certainly once you begin to go beyond there it gets much more questionable. So we still have that issue of the current membership of the Eurozone and the difficulty of leaving a common currency area to deal with before we can get to a viable two-speed model for Europe.
Thank you. I believe I saw the hand of Mark Leonard. I'll bring you in.
Hi, I was just wondering what kind of choice Professor Weiler had in mind as a way of holding the EU together. Would it be a choice in favour of greater austerity, like most German citizens that were one that would bring the Eurozone closer together, or one of more fiscal loosening? Would it be about letting more refugees in and having refugee allocations from different countries, or would it be having a kind of fortress Europe? I mean, it's pretty clear that one of the reasons the EU, I think, has survived as long as it has is because it protects minorities from those kind of majoritarian choices that you're describing, and as soon as you remove that, the whole structure would become incredibly brittle. You used the example of the UK, and you said people accepted it when the Labour Party lost elections, they didn't question the existence of the UK. Except in Scotland, they kind of did, when they kept on voting Labour and getting Conservative governments. Support for independence went up very, very high, and it put a huge amount of pressure on the existence of the Union. I suspect that if you had real majoritarian politics at an EU level, you'd have those sorts of dynamics multiplied manyfold, and you know, it might be that you end up with a federal European Union with 2 or 3 member states that have very closely aligned interests with each other. I can't see how you could even have the original 6 member states in a union where you had real majoritarian politics of the type that you're describing.
Thank you. Can I actually fold that into a broader question? I would like all the panelists, including Professor Weiler, who this question was addressed, to comment on this. So, what is the vision then for Europe? And one criticism of the Remain campaign was that they failed to articulate a positive case for integration. So what is the affirmative case for the benefits of the EU? So what is it that we're fighting for if we want to save this project? So if I can start from Professor Weiler, since he got the question, and then move to Professor Vickers, and then come back here.
You've already noticed that I have an aversion to sound bites.
I think we have a little bit more time. We have time until 3.
Oh, until 3. Okay, that's half an hour. just teasing.
2:45, and we want to bring some audience questions to length.
Look, democracies are sometimes fragile. But actually the UK and the Scotland example, I think in an act of great statesmanship, the United Kingdom allowed Scotland alone to take a referendum on her future in the United Kingdom. Something that, for example, the government in Madrid would never allow Catalonia to do. But that showed political maturity. And despite the tensions and all the rest, the Scots voted to stay in. So it showed the robustness of British democracy. I also want to clarify something. Neither Sir John or I was saying because of the problems we raised, this is a justification for Brexit. I think both of us think it was regrettable and unnecessary. But there was another common thread between his point on the euro and my point on the democracy deficit. These are not Brexit-related problems. These are problems that existed before and exist now, and their corrosive effects would be felt even without Brexit. And we see their corrosive effects in the rise of populism, in France, in so many countries. People respond when they have these kinds of challenges of governance. To answer directly to your question with tongue-in-cheek, you asked me, would I go for austerity or would I go for growth? That's a typical European type of way of putting it. Let's decide what we will do. I would just ask the people and follow the majority, as it should be in a democracy.
Thank you. Professor Vickers.
So this is the European vision that we want now, is it?
Yes, the European vision and the
right.
case for integration.
I mean, in terms of achievements, I would put at the top of the list, as has been mentioned, the enlargement of the community. It was controversial at the time, but I think my conjecture is that history would look on that as an extraordinarily important and valuable thing to do. Although I did think that the Remain campaign in the UK did become too much like Project Fear, with, I thought, absurdly precise sounding estimates of how much we will be worse off in pounds per year or so. I thought that was, I didn't think we'll be worse off, but I think that made it all too economistic. And for oddly, I found myself partly swayed by the economic arguments, but as much by the identity issues as anything else. I discovered during the Scottish referendum, well, I'm English, but I discovered in the Scottish referendum that my own national identity, I had no vote or anything, I don't feel English at all, I feel British. I just discovered it about myself, it was quite interesting. But equally, I feel European. And I don't feel European as just the EU. I mean, we had a family holiday, which luckily I paid for before the 23rd June, in Switzerland. That is a great European country. It's fantastic. So I think we shouldn't see it too much in terms necessarily of the EU. I'm pleased that we as a family, my father, who's a lifelong Tory, he's in his mid-90s, so you might have thought he'd be a Brexit, but thank goodness for family harmony, he was very strongly in favour of a stand. And we've got 3 children, and it was about the second time they'd been able to vote in anything. They could vote in last year's general election. And, I mean, for them, their sense of identity, I think very much wants to be an international one. And the idea that there's a certain set of problems which one country, even a sizable country, cannot solve on its own, and that you need to do these things together, it can be quite inspiring. I think part of the problem with the European project as exercised is and it goes to the democratic deficit point, is I think there's been an overreach and a doctrinaire insistence on uniformity in all sorts of areas where it's quite unnecessary. For example, in agricultural policy, I'm told weather conditions in Andalusia and in northern Finland are different. But there's one set of things that farmers have to do. And I just think a bit more easing up and flexibility and focusing on the things where cooperation and a united stand really matters. And then, I never liked this word subsidiarity. Remember there was this phase where I didn't like that word because there was a kind of noblesse oblige about it. Oh, well, all right, you know. And I think a bit more focus on some areas and being just a bit more liberal and less doctrinaire on others would be a good way to go. One last point, and again I'm trying to articulate Brexit type of arguments, I think one shouldn't assume that this is all Little England mentality. And I go back to the wider internationalism. You know, the EU's external trade policy linked to a very protectionist, inefficient, vested interest-dominated agricultural policy. It is not pretty. And when you look at it from the perspective of emerging market economies, developing economies, a lot of them very reliant on agriculture. You know, I think if one was trying to be very optimistic, you could imagine within a decade the UK reaching trade agreements outside the EU once it has the freedom to do that, which I think would be stand up much better morally, actually, as well as economically, than some aspects of EU policy.
Thank you. John Authers.
Again, I find myself in great agreement with a lot of what I've heard. I also, as a British person who spends most of their time dealing with economics and trying as hard as possible to be dispassionate, that's what you have to be as a journalist, found myself more upset, more moved and angry at a personal level about this than about any other political issue I can remember. And that's more about politics and identity than it is about the economy. I think economically this is a bad idea. The main reason it's a bad idea is that the sheer opportunity cost of the amount of time and effort it's going to take trying to disentangle ourselves and work out a new relationship with Europe rather than actually trying to get on with dealing with the main issues. But what at heart makes Britain's membership of Europe seem important to me and is a vision worth holding on to is one of internationalism. It's something that has changed in my lifetime, that kids now really care about whether soccer teams qualify for Europe. You see people wearing Barcelona shirts and Milan shirts in the streets in London. We cared, back when I was a child, there was a show called Jeux Sans Frontières that people cared about very passionately, where different teams from different countries used to dress up in fancy dress and hit themselves over the head with rubber mallets, and that was That was an early example of how there was a sense of a European cohesion where there was something we could all get together on, but where the European differences remained. Eurovision is now becoming actually genuinely a very popular song contest, even though it's rubbish. People love the sense of Eurokitsch. There have steadily been a growth in things that are actually European, and Britain has been part of it, and Britain has been better for it. If you want another profound case for Remain, Germany and France fought each other for 3 times in 70 years, roughly, before the first stage of the European Union came into existence. The EU in one form or another has been around for roughly 70 years, and they haven't fought each other once. It's ultimately a political project. Europe has been a powder keg for any number of wars over the years. The fact that it has that role, that it has helped work as a bulwark against conflict, against war, is very, very important. The final argument, it seems to me, that is still worth articulating, and that wasn't articulated. Oh, sorry. We have the argument about the Remain case. Perhaps the single greatest flaw of the Remain case that was made in the British election, British referendum, and I suppose it was because David Cameron's strategy was always going to be, I'm going to have a big renegotiation and then I'm going to come back and put this deal to you. It fails completely to make the point that we already had a great deal out of Europe. We had the single market, but we had the right to go and live wherever else we wanted in the EU, but we didn't sign up to Schengen and we didn't sign up to the euro. We already had a fantastic take it or leave it bespoke deal out of Europe that had been negotiated by various people over the years. The Prime Minister who had actually signed us up to the Single European Act was Margaret Thatcher, who very quietly is on record as saying that was the biggest mistake she ever made. The fact remains that various decisions after that meant that we already had a very, very good, very individual, very distinct deal. Sorry, having got that parochial British sense of annoyance out of my way, the final great argument in favour of Europe is precisely freedom of movement. I think it's wonderful. My wife is American. She got her British passport 2.5 years ago. It allows her to live and work without any extra capital in 27, 28 countries. My kids, until recently, I assumed would have the right, if they wanted to go, they speak Spanish very well because a couple of them were born in Mexico, would have the right to go and live in Barcelona or Madrid if they wanted to. That is wonderful. It's also wonderful, gets back to the old hoary question of industrial policy. Should it be about taking the jobs to the people and the people to the jobs? We have great Eastern European population in the UK who have come to do jobs that they do rather better than the indigenous population did before. It works well for everybody. We have better plumbing, we have better builders and so on, who are prepared to work for a wage that they're prepared to work at. It's at an economic level, freedom of movement is a wonderful idea. Very hard for me to see that immigration has actually been of any great harm to people in the UK, even if it is perceived as being such. So that is the other great case for integration, for continued integration, is that line in the sand, that "il ne passeront pas" line that we've already heard from about the EU, freedom of movement.
Thank you. And then, Ambassador, as an Italian, as a European, what are we fighting for?
I would simply say as a European, I would say, because I can agree with most of comments made by my fellow panelists, but I might elaborate on some of them because I think that at the end of the day, since I started my comments by saying that I do represent Europe here at the table, because Europe must be here as sort of advocate, we should never forget where we come from. And the very reasons why we decided to create this artificial body that we now come to name the EU. Of course, there is a lack of democracy. It is a cumbersome procedure. It is very difficult. Believe me, sitting around the table with representatives of other countries is not always easy. The first time I arrived in Brussels, we were 12 members around the table. Then we actually moved to 15, and then 26, and then 28. The more the members around the table, the more difficult it is. But this is true democracy. Of course, we have to move on. We have to increase the legitimacy. But just to speak on behalf of Brussels, Brussels actually does what member states actually allow Brussels to do. So there is a need to move on. It is in a way telling that we started to ask questions about the reasons why Britain left, and then we very easily turn to interrogate ourselves on what is not working in Europe. Back in '89, when we managed to start enlarging Europe, when we started to tear down walls, when we started a very important enlargement, because having the 5 lender of Eastern Germany into Europe was a true enlargement, a very expensive one. That was a year when in a part of Europe where we didn't have the EU, the Balkans, that was the start of the tragedy. We should never forget that. So it's very easy simply to turn back and think that because of selfish interest, because of there is a wall outside Europe, we better do something else. There is no something else. There is a process that we have to cherish, that we have to promote, that we have to make more effective, but this is what we have. I think that our leaders should speak their mind and should have the courage to tell the truth to the citizens. Because what Brexit tells us is there's nothing given for granted. So that's why I think that we have to move on. Things are difficult, as we said, starting from the economic policy. I know that there is a debate going on in Europe, flexibility versus austerity. I think that if Europe is not perceived as a tool, a mechanism, allowing our economy to be really pro-growth, this would further create problems in the legitimacy. I think this is true for all member states in Europe. The same goes for migration. We cannot leave migration only to geography. We cannot leave this historic process that has to be harnessed unless there is a common response. I think this goes to the core of what Euro stands for. We manage a single currency just for the sake of leaving this clear. When accessing the EU, new member states took the obligation to join the common currency. They didn't do so, and this was something that really changed the dynamic. Because this pick and choose is something that goes really opposite what Euro stands for. Of course, we do know that having a common currency without a proper fiscal policy, without common mechanism, is very partial, is not working. I think we should go in that direction. This is the only way that we have to ensure that the EU remains a viable project.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to bring in our audience. We had a question here in the front, and then we have the second one.
Hi, Kristen Silverberg. I just wanted to hop in on the democratic deficit problem that Professor Vickers addressed. One option for addressing that is to introduce majoritarian politics at the European level, but of course another answer is to shift decision-making to the member states. In recent years, we've seen European proposals on the size of cucumbers, the marketing of jam, how you serve olive oil at restaurants. The European Union is about the size of the British Empire at its height, and it sometimes behaves like a city council. And I think this was one of those issues that Prime Minister Cameron put on the table, and the European response was was insufficient, and I wonder how much you attribute of the current Brexit vote to the failure of Brussels to respond to sort of core issues about the level of decision making.
Professor Vickers, would you take that?
Well, I think you get a more intelligent answer from Professor Weiler, but as my remark may have indicated, I do think that there is too much doctrinaire application of, it's not just the amount of regulation, I think a lot of it is misdirected. As the introductory remarks indicated, and I just want to give one example, I've been very involved in post-crisis banking reform, and the commission which I chaired in the UK recommended that the internationally agreed baseline levels for bank capital were too low, we should go above. There was a moment when it looked as though Brussels might thwart that on the basis that everybody had to do the same. I said, well, wait a minute, that's a minimum. Why can't you have freedom to go, no, it's all got to be the same. But look, if we go higher, that makes more safety for everyone. It's good for everyone. No, you wouldn't have different standards in London and Leeds. This is total madness. It's the equivalent of saying in pollution control, here's the pollution agreement, you've got to emit at least that much carbon dioxide, otherwise there's an unfairness or whatever. Completely crazy. Now, there could just be a retreat from such madness and to focus more on the things that where cooperation really is essential.
Thank you. We had a question there in the middle. Thank you.
Seems to me there's a democratic contradiction because the Oxford professor, whose name I now don't know because there seems to be a mix-up, talked about the lack of representation. On the other hand, it was also stated that the European Parliament has seen its authority expanded. The ambassador said more recently that the decisions in the European Union are finally made by the member governments. Now, it's also been said that European people are concerned about their national identity and national sovereignty. So the problem in the European Union seems to be that these national governments want to preserve as much authority as possible in relation to the European Parliament. How do you reconcile these two opposite desires?
Would Professor Weiler want to respond to this, following up on the comments on democratic deficit?
It's a classic tension of all federal arrangements, and in all of them it's resolved one way or another.
Thank you. We had a gentleman there in the middle.
Hello. I would first like to thank you very much for this discussion in the panel and the very interesting comments I've heard so far. I am an European. I consider myself first and foremost an European. I am part of that generation that has lived through Erasmus. I'm the Erasmus generation, and I would like to, first of all, to make some short remarks. First of all, related to the comparison made to, with the offer made to Canada, for example. That comprehensive trade agreement hasn't actually been yet signed by all countries, namely Romania, where I come from, amongst other countries. And it shows exactly that it's very hard to pass agreements for the whole Europe and also to convince all the 27, 28 countries of an agreement with the UK afterwards. And also making a parallel with Turkey, given that the customs agreement with Turkey was signed in 1996, 1997, it's again a very different situation than what I see and perceive as a young European. And
The point I was trying to make with these comparisons, not if it's politically viable or not, if Romania will accept, is that it's a bogeyman to say if you don't accept free movement of workers, then we can't give you access to the market. Because here we are offering access to the market to all and sundry without free movement of people.
But there is this distinction between access to and membership of. which I think is that's a really big distinction.
It's exactly, and that's the price Britain will pay for Brexit.
Yeah.
That they should. The union should allow them access, but they're not members, so they don't sit around the table and decide the stances, etc. That's exactly the difference.
I'd say it's a bigger difference. Rather than get into this big discussion, in London, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, it's on their website, put out a paper on this, I think, last month, exactly on this distinction and what it means in practical terms. So, advert.
So we have time for one more question. Gentleman there. Oh, it's George again.
Yeah. It's a very interesting discussion, but I would like to go from there to there. The shareholders of the London Stock Exchange and Deutsche Börse have decided to merge the two largest European markets to create an integrated European equity market and derivative market that will be in London and will be the combination of Deutsche Börse and the London Stock Exchange. Shouldn't the politicians start to listen to what business is going to do? Because there is a lot of business stakes in this whole debate, while we've been discussing immigration and other issues, but most of the treaties that are going to have to be renegotiated are going to be business treaties.
Can I have maybe Mr. Authers respond, please?
Well, as an FT journalist, I'm fairly certain it's FT policy that we think governments and politicians should listen to business. Doesn't necessarily mean they have to always do what they're told. I don't actually think the example you just gave is a very good one. By the same token, you could point to the merger of Euronext, which is a merger of a number of different European stock exchanges, including France and Spain, with the New York Stock Exchange, which subsequently got bought up again by a company ultimately based in Atlanta. It doesn't necessarily mean that there is an inchoate desire by businesses for a political union between the US and Europe. In terms of should there be more of a need to listen to the precise business agenda, yes, there is. I think it comes back to the point I made earlier. There were a very significant number of people on the side of in business on the side of leaving the EU. Certainly very aware of this because the FT took a strong position and we got a lot of pushback from lots of loyal readers who disagreed with the position that we had taken. My great fear, there are many good arguments that were utterly irrelevant to the results of the referendum that we've heard from Sir John earlier about problems with the way that the European Union works. To put it mildly, we're not just talking about the disasters within the Eurozone, we're talking about very often misguided approach to harmonisation and regulation. But I think a lot of the people in the business sector who were pushing for Brexit had in mind a very different Brexit from the one that we are most likely to get. I think the kind of arguments I've heard from Professor Weiler today give me somewhat greater belief that maybe there is a way of getting out of that cleft stick, but at the moment we have, as is true of conservatism in this country, a divide between a populist movement whose biggest signature issue at the moment is opposition to migration, and a pro-business movement that believes in things like free trade, low taxes, and so on, that is very different. We have to see what happens in this country, but again, I come back to where I started. I fear that the populist movement that more than anything else wants to see limits on migration is more important, more politically powerful than the business segment. And I think the people in business who were in favour of Brexit for generally good reasons that weren't articulated in the campaign will end up being very unhappy with the results that they confront.
Thank you. I know our audience have more questions, but it's time to end this panel and welcome our next set of speakers. But please first join me. Thank you for explaining.